Hello, good evening and welcome to Face the Nation. Tonight's show we're going to take on a bit of an international flavor. No matter where you look in the globe these days, it seems that you cannot escape crises. There's bushfires raging in Australia, there's a trade war ongoing between the US and China, two of the world's most powerful countries, and there's the prospect of war between the United States and Iran. Where does Sri Lanka fit into this jigsaw puzzle of global geopolitical interests? What is our country's policy when it comes to dealing with not only the global superpowers but also the regional superpowers? What kind of soft power can Sri Lanka exert in these situations? In short, what is our role in the greater global context? To discuss this and more, we've got on our panel this evening Dr. Harinder Vidanage. He's the Executive Director of the Bandaranaike Center for International Studies, joining us on the show once again after a lapse of a few months. Thank you, Dr. Vidanage, for accepting our invitation and being here this evening to share your expertise on current global issues. We're also joined by Dr. Bilesha Weeraratne. She's a research fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies, an economist and a specialist on immigration and migration. Thank you very much, Dr. Bilesha Weeraratne, for joining us on the show this evening as well. And we're also joined by senior journalist Mr. Amin Izzuddin, the deputy editor of the Sunday Times, also international editor for the Vijay Group. He has extensive experience covering international affairs in the local press. On our panel of journalists this evening, we have to my immediate left Mr. Shehan Ranatunga, and on my far left, Ms. Azra Asan. Dr. Vidanage, I'd like to start with you this evening, and very obvious question: do you see the current tensions that we're seeing in the Middle East, which sort of culminated with the downing of the Ukrainian Airlines flight, which Iran claimed as a mistake? We've seen a similar incident occur in the past as well in 1988, when the tables were kind of turned at that time, when the US downed an Iran Air flight. Do you see an escalation of these tensions between the US and Iran, given that Iran has also now decided that it's no longer going to abide by the nuclear deal?
Well, I think the unfortunate downing of the Ukrainian airline to a certain extent doused the immediate, escalation. It seems like, ironically, the people who, died actually, made a sacrifice in a way that it kind of contained the situation. But looking at the bigger picture, if you look what is happening now, it's quite clear that the Iranian establishment, especially the theocratic establishment, is still very angry over the assassination of General Soleimani, and Iran is forced to kind of respond. I mean, it did a limited response where it fired a barrage of rockets on two American bases in Iraq, but I don't think that's the ideal response Iranians wants to provide, because killing of Soleimani was quite a hit on the large Iranian presence and influence in the region, and of course beyond the region. It's not a Middle Eastern thing. The Iranians were establishing significant network to a certain extent within the region as well as beyond the region. So the immediate escalation seems to have died down, but it also helped the Americans to a certain extent to re-establish, to what we call create a new surge of American personnel. See, there was a surge in American personnel within the last few weeks. That has not, the Americans haven't withdrawn. So to a certain extent, the militaristic element in the Middle East remains quite the same. The short-term escalation has died down, but that doesn't mean there is the longer-term implications are still there. We still don't know what exactly the Iranians plan to do to respond to what the US have done, and we still also don't know what the US plans are in the longer run. So in short, yes, in short term things are calm, but in the long term we still cannot say.
But when you compare the current context to let's say, the context in '88 when these two countries were again sort of were on the brink of war. The politics in the neighborhood have also changed. I mean, the Baath party is no longer in power in Iraq. Iraq has a government that leans very much towards the Iranian perspective. And also politics within the United States as well is deeply polarized. You're seeing a lot of division on President Trump's actions. And I think the Speaker is putting forward, or the Democrats in the US House are planning on putting forward a resolution seeking to limit the President's war powers. In this, do you feel that these changing political conditions, that these changed political conditions rather, will have a bearing on how this progresses?
Yeah, definitely, because the Iranians didn't have this much of a clout in the 80s. You know, the rise of the Quds forces, the Quds element of the IGRC, the Iranian Revolution Guard, was exactly as a result of its failures during the 80-88 war, right? Where the Iraqis had a certain element of advantage over the Iranian military. So the Quds force was developed to a certain extent to kind of counter that. And the Quds have achieved just what they have been developed for, the influence they have across the region, right? By establishing sub-state or non-state, you know, pro-Iranian or Shia or non-Shia elements, such as Hamas. Hamas is also supported. You have Hezbollah, you have Katabi Hezbollah, you have Badr force in Iraq, which are all elements which have been developed by the Iranians. So to a certain extent, the Iranian network is quite bigger and wider. So the Iranian influence is wider and deeper now. So that will. So I do not think they would want to lose that influence at this particular moment, given the fact there is a vacuum of power, the fact that the Americans have withdrawn to a certain extent. And of course, coming back to President Trump, you also see the Trump policies. I think the other two speakers can speak to this as well. Is what we call Trump's foreign policy is what we call transactional. The first transactionist president we have, if you heard him yesterday or day before, he said, we are helping the Saudis, but they are paying us for the help. So in a fact, so it's helping the Americans. So his whole argument is about this whole corporate model. So it's also a very interesting dynamic of how these approaches, foreign policy as well as Iranian projection of power, posture actually in the region. So that's what we have to be very carefully, focused on, because it's very different from what we are talking about in the 80s. There's a qualitative difference in the whole structure.
Thank you, Dr. Bandaranaike. Next, I'd like to move to Dr. Bilesha Weeraratne, Research Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. Dr. Weeraratne, you've looked at, there's an ongoing migration crisis across on the Mediterranean crossing, and we've seen what interventions, or rather the collapse of the Gaddafi regime in Libya, and in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, and the wars or the conflicts of attrition that have sprung up in these areas, we've seen the migration crisis that has arisen as a result. Do you see these current tensions, the US-Iran tensions, escalating to a point where it adds fuel to that fire?
I think to a certain extent it would add fuel to the fire, because as you might already know, there has been a kind of a decrease in our migration departure trends in the recent years. And with this sort of uncertainty in the Middle Eastern region, a new migrant who's considering to go to the Middle East for the first time might be a little bit hesitant to go. He might kind of postpone his or her plan. And also, someone who's already in the Middle East might kind of reconsider whether they want to stay longer. If there's a need that might call them home, they might make the decision sooner and come back to Sri Lanka. So there is this uncertainty kind of makes people want to postpone their migration decision, and whoever's kind of thinking of coming back a little to decide to come back faster. And then Also, we have to think about people not only coming back to Sri Lanka, but then they might want to move out to other countries outside the Middle East. For skilled migrants, that might be an option, but for low-skilled migrants, still there might be a little bit of a limitation. Yeah, so there might be some.
Do you see this leading to a decline in remittances that are being sent back to Sri Lanka?
Remittances also has been on the decline in recent years. So last year we had about 7.1 billion US dollars, which was a little lower than the 7.2 billion we had the previous year. So some of the reasons that contributed to this decline were, of course, some of the security concerns or the uncertain situation in the Middle East countries and the oil prices. But here there is kind of two forces going in this instance. So on the one hand, if we don't have enough migrants leaving to the Middle East, our stock of migrants in the Middle East will go down, and therefore the remittance capacity or the number of people to remit back to Sri Lanka will go down. But then there's also this other argument that when oil prices go up, there is a capacity for remittances also to go up. But in this case, as we know, there was a sudden upward movement in the oil prices. But then again, these oil prices didn't go up for the right economic reasons that would trigger the remittances. It was kind of this uncertainty that created it. So there might not be enough investment or new hires to push up the remittances to Sri Lanka. But there is also, so both sides are going on, so there'll be a trade-off. So my belief is remittances also will suffer in the short run, but the optimist in me think that things will settle and it might not have a lasting effect on remittances.
When we're talking about Sri Lanka and Iran's economic relations, a constant factor is tea, Iran being one of the 5 biggest importers of Sri Lankan tea. Do you see that economic relationship between Iran and Sri Lanka suffering as a result of these heightened tensions?
I'm not a trade expert, but I think there might be a little bit of a repercussion, because if the country is not stable enough to go on with their normal business or business as usual, as we say, they might not want to import their regular basket of goods. So that might change, and then that might have an impact on the demand for our tea exports from Sri Lanka to Iran.
Thank you, Dr. Veeraratne. And finally, in this first round, we come to Mr. Izzeddin. Mr. Amin Izzeddin is the deputy editor of the Sunday Times and also international editor for the Vijay Group as a whole. Mr. Izzeddin, throughout your long career of covering international affairs, have you witnessed something like what we're seeing in the present, in the past? Do you see any key differences between, the Cold War era tensions in the Middle East and then the immediate aftermath of the Cold War and what we're seeing now in the 21st century with regional powers on the rise? Do you see any major deviations?
Well, I see it as, it is the pattern in the Middle East. The Middle East has been, witnessing wars and wars for thousands of years. It was even before the advent of Islam in the Middle East and in today's Saudi Arabia, there were wars. And after the advent of Islam, there had been wars. Since then, there were caliphates, then there were crusades, and then there were, the creation of Israel in 1948, then the Arab-Israeli wars, then Iran-Iraq wars, and at present, you have multiple fronts wars are taking place. So it's a kind of a crisis-ridden, conflict-ridden region. So the present escalation is, it's just another addition to this going on. What has been happening for millennia in the region. So what I see is it's a powder keg, as you know, but fortunately things are simmering down a little bit, and both United States, despite a president like Donald Trump in control in the administration, and the Iranians, they have realized the realities of the need to their national interest would be best served if they kind of calm down and deal this crisis maturely. They are doing it. When the Iranians launched the missile attacks on the two Iraqi bases where the United States have forces, they had been well advanced informed that things are coming. The missiles are coming. So that's as an indication that Iran is thinking maturely. It's a mature politics. They don't want any escalation because that was not in the interest of any of the countries, perhaps with the exception of Israel. But the other regional countries, even Saudi Arabia, was not in favor of a major war. Today, the Qatari Amir was visiting Iran, and they were talking, the need for peace in the region. So it was, I think, the mixed signals are in a way good. Like, say, for instance, it was not all-out war going to take place. So we see kind of, there's chance that there are moves for peace, and things are happening the way it should be.
Mr. Izzeddin, when you look at how, I was asking Dr. Bandaranaike earlier about the changing politics in the Middle Eastern region as well. You mentioned Qatar as well. I mean, back in the 80s, Qatar was not a powerful sort of country, but for a pretty small country, in the past sort of decade or so, Qatar has emerged as a major regional power, and you saw that crisis with the other GCC countries as well, which were quite unhappy about Qatar's close relationship with the Iranian regime. There are a lot of sort of soft power players in that region right now. Do you see, when you're covering sort of these stories, and you look at Sri Lanka's policy towards in dealing with these powers and with these countries, have you seen any changes? Because we enjoy friendly relations with both Iran and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE and all of those Middle Eastern countries. Do you see any need for Sri Lanka to change the way that we're approaching our Middle East policy?
Well, Sri Lanka should, as the President Gotabaya Rajapaksa said in his inaugural speech, we have to be a neutral power with regard to, I think he was talking about vis-a-vis US and China. But the same policy should apply to other conflicts as well. So we have to draw the the middle line, maintain the balance. So that had been our our foreign policy, with the exception of the Israeli-Arab conflict. We took the we were on the side of the Arabs, because we know the Palestinians have been not given their due place in this conflict, and they were the victims. So in terms of the non-aligned policy, we took the side of the Palestinian people. But with regard to other crises that are taking place, like between Iran and the other regional powers, between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, in Yemen crisis, the Sri Lanka has been, very, even the previous government and the present government, they have been maintaining a balanced policy. For us, all these countries are important, because Middle East and the entire Middle Eastern region, that is our job market, is our export market, and we have to be very careful. Job market, export market, and also another important factor is the question of terrorism. Things are happening in that part of the world, so that cooperation is very important between the countries and Sri Lanka. So as a result, we have to maintain a very balanced policy. With Iran too, Iran had been, as we have been buying Iranian crude for our Sapagaskan refinery, and suddenly when the Americans imposed the sanctions, one of the countries badly affected was Sri Lanka. So we have to be very, very careful when dealing with especially now other powers also there, not only the regional powers, the Middle Eastern countries, but there is United States involved in the Middle Eastern crisis. Russia is now very much involved they are in Syria militarily, and they have their interest in the Middle East. And China, Belt and Road, as you said, they have the Iran is a very key port, key country in the BRI, the road. So as a result, we have to be, we have to maintain a very neutral foreign policy, and I think we are doing that exactly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amin Izzeddin. Let's move on. Let's open the floor for questions from our two journalists this evening, Shehan and Azra. Let's start with Azra.
Yes, I would first pose my question to Dr. Bandaranaike. Deviating a little bit from the Middle Eastern crisis, if we talk about the US-China trade war that is going on, now the United States President has mentioned his intention to sign an agreement with China. US on the one hand is a big, huge power in the world, and it pretty much has a say in a lot of things that's going on in the world. And China, on the other hand, has close bilateral relations with Sri Lanka. Giving a small local touch to the topic that we're having today, can you tell us, will Sri Lanka have an impact when it comes to the US-China trade war, or what is the agreement that they're going to sign in the future?
Well, typically, it depends on what elements. For example, deviating away from Sri Lanka a little bit, you take the example of India, because it's the current discussion, India and Iran. For example, India and Iran are developing the port in Chaba, right? And the Americans have provided a waiver to the Indians when it comes to the development of the port. So, if you look at Sri Lanka vis-a-vis US-China trade war, I don't see a direct impact still yet. For example, the trade war of course started with the tariffs, but I think it really started to concentrate on the tech industry, especially Huawei. That's where it ended. Mm-hmm. But the US has also now slowly unraveling some of its demands and regulations it put on Huawei. It's giving certain amnesties to Huawei to do things. So unless the Americans put a blanket demand, for example, on countries, for example, not to deal with Huawei and not to let Huawei establish the communications backbone. It hasn't happened yet, as of yet. For example, even the British, the German tech industry still has a lot of Huawei input. So though we say this in these terms of trade war as a universal phenomenon, it's not a universal phenomenon. There are still a lot of gray areas about how exactly it is affecting.
But there's a possibility that Sri Lanka can get affected, though.
Yeah, for example, there are certain things. For example, now banks, if it's a HSBC, or HSBC had a significant stake of Huawei investment, it had to shed that because the Americans said if you are going to trade with Huawei, we are going to create serious problems. So. Likewise, direct. So I don't see a significant impact as yet on Sri Lanka. I think maybe Dr. Vilesha can highlight the economic. Since I'm not an economist, I can't go into economic details. But overall, I don't still see, because the real reason is because Sri Lanka is not bound to certain things the Americans bring to the table at the moment. If we are having certain agreements with the US, certain strategic military or economic agreements, which exclusively where the US can say you can't use these suppliers, then we are in trouble. But in the larger onset of the tariff, the trade, the so-called trade war, I don't still agree with the term. I don't think it's going to be a big impact on Sri Lanka, because I think we are also missing certain points. The biggest trade war that is coming is not the US-China, but there's a big trade war coming between the Europe and US, with France already introducing a tech tax on Google, Apple, Amazon, and the Brits following up, and the possibility of EU following up. And there's a huge, the Americans are going to impose taxes worth of $3.2 billion just on French goods. So these are trade wars we are not seeing yet, which we are still not getting. So of course, trade wars are not great for global economy. It's not. It hinders the logic of how a free and open economy functions. But it's difficult at this moment to say where exactly Sri Lanka will be affected. Of course, the prices of goods may go up. Mm-hmm. If there is a trade war between these two countries, because we rely heavily on imports, So certain goods, goods, the prices of global markets, the prices of goods will go up. Then we'll have a problem. So that will have a secondary effect on, Sri Lankan consumers. So or on the state as well. But that's where I think it is at the moment.
Thank you, Dr. Vidanaike. I would like to pose my next question to Mr. Izzadeen. Although Sri Lanka is a small country, given its strategic location and the geopolitical importance, when it comes to the Middle Eastern problem between the Iran, Iraq, US, and that's what's going on now, where do we stand as a country?
Well, we do stand, on the precarious junction, maybe a crossroad. What we want at the moment is peace in the country. There was a time Sri Lanka played peacemaker role, be it the India-China war in the 1960s, or the Hungarian crisis in the 1956 or so. We played a major role, and we played a major role in the Middle Eastern peace process also, and in the Iran-Iraq war too. And our then Foreign Minister, Mr. A.C.S. Hamid, he was sent as an emissary by the then President, Mr. J.R. Jayawardena, to make peace between the two countries. Unfortunately, it did not, bear fruit. So, anyhow, we made efforts, and we played we played internationally a very, our diplomatic power was very much, in the context of non-aligned movement. We were playing a very key active role. But at present, now we are taking, I think the government is taking a kind of wait and see policy, like let's see what is happening, while not, not allowing our diplomatic relations with these countries being affected by the goings on of the policies that we would take. But we have been friends to all the Middle Eastern countries, most of them. Even with Israel, now we have established diplomatic relations. We have an embassy there in Tel Aviv, but yet we maintain our close relations with the Arabs too. So Sri Lanka is, very much very good, relations with all the countries. President Sirisena visited Iran about a couple of years back. President Rajapaksa visited Iran for the non-aligned summit, and they received a roaring welcome in that country. And Mr. Rajapaksa was also, he visited other Middle Eastern countries like Bahrain, Qatar, where he received his visit was given wide publicity in the media in those countries. And so our relationship with these Middle Eastern countries has been very, very good, and there needs to be. But the thing is that the present leadership also, I think, we hope that they will make a lot of state visits to that particular part of the world and establish further cement these friendly ties.
Thank you, Mr. Shehan.
I'd like to firstly ask Dr. Vidanaike. I asked this question because it's something that people commented on, speculated on soon after the incidents between the US and Iran last week. World War III, in your opinion? I understand things have eased now, but any chance that we're headed in that direction now?
No, Shayan, no. We are not. We are not. Of course, this idea of World War III and US-Iran war has always been there. In my own writings, I predicted this 2 years back. In my own column, which I said, US will go to war with Iran. But it will not be a war that many others want to get dragged into. Unlike the First World and the Second World War, which, especially if you look at the Second World War, there were alliance systems. We don't have in the Middle East any alliance systems, right? Globally, the alliance systems are weak. The only real alliance we have is NATO. But NATO itself, I don't think NATO countries would commit to a US-led war on Iran to start off. And in the Middle East region, there is no real alliance system. The only alliance we are seeing at the moment is the very thin alliance that, even still, which is now running into problem, the UAE Saudi alliance when combating the Houthis in Yemen. So what you see is there is no state-led alliance system, because the world goes to war when both times in the history when there were rigid alliances. Rigid alliances always diffuse the space of flexibility. There's enough flexibility in the world where countries can work around crises. There's going to be a lot of hotspots and flashpoints, but I don't see a potential of any of these transforming into significant world wars.
Has the threat of nuclear warfare increased the risk of this? We know we have North Korea. President Trump, in fact, issued a statement saying that in his term he will not allow Iran to have nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
So the threat of nuclear warfare seems to have increased the risk of world war.
Yeah, but nuclear, though we see this idea of the apocalypse, the winter is coming in a certain way, a country would be compelled to use a nuclear weapon. I'll give you examples. Let's say North Korea or Iran. Say the whole argument is that they might use a nuclear weapon, but no country is going to use a nuclear platform unless they have a second strike capability. What do you mean by a second strike capability? Nuclear weapons come in what we call three, platforms, how they are deployed. So normally, the greater, the US, Russia, Britain to a certain extent, China is also trying. They possess what we call a nuclear triad. Nuclear triad is the ability to use nuclear weapons from an airborne, ground, and a seaborne platform. So basically, that means if you fire a nuclear weapon, you always should be ready for a counterattack. So that is why the submarines are so important. That is why countries like China, India, they're all trying to set up nuclear submarines, nuclear armed submarines. Neither Iran nor North Korea has this capability where they can have. So that is what we call second strike capability, which is have a nuclear weapon offshore. If your country is attacked, with the ability to counterattack, which is what we call second strike capability. If not, the mantra in nuclear war is very simple. We teach students as we call this MAD, mutually assured destruction. But the most simpler term is why nuclear weapons are not used is because the idea that mantra is whoever fires first dies second. So I think if you don't possess a nuclear triad, you are obviously going to die if you fire. So use of nukes by Iran and North Korea, so it doesn't add up. So there is no rationality in a war strategy by either of these countries. Even Kim, I don't think would use that because he knows there is no way he can defend North Korea. No way can Iran if it uses. So at the moment, both these countries are using this as a deterrence to a certain extent.
If I could get your opinion as well, Mr. Izzadeen, on this matter. What's your opinion on the current situation? Do you agree with Dr. Vidhanage that?
Yeah, to a great extent I do, because Iran has said several times that it is not developing a nuclear weapon as such. What it has been saying is, we want nuclear. Our program is aimed at peaceful, targets, like say, for instance, for medical research, for electricity generation, for such purposes. But the Western countries, especially the United States, they don't have the trust in the Iranian statements. So they think you should not allow, if you allow Iran to continue, if you make, enrich uranium to say 20%, that means you have the technology to develop the enriched uranium to about 85%. That's the weapon grade uranium. So they have the technology, but they have not. But many people have expressed fears that if you allow let Iran freedom to do what it wants, and within say 6 months, some say within 2 years, they will be they can make a bomb. So those fears are there. But as he said, I don't think there will be a World War III. What is happening now is something called the some experts call the hybrid warfare. So they use in a way it's some kind of, it's not actually Cold War time, what really happened, but this time the conventional and unconventional means are used in this hybrid warfare, like psychological warfare, like real attacks, calculated measured attacks, like what happened in the killing of the Qasem Soleimani and the Iranian attacks on the American base. These are calculated attacks, and they calculated in such a way that they would not flare up as a major conflict. But at the same time, at different levels, the war will continue. Like say cyber warfare is going on between Iran and the United States. Iranian, I read a statement sometime back, in a couple of days back, where every year in 2018 alone, there were 33 million cyber attacks on Iran. So most of them, they say they claim that they had somehow tackled them and dealt with them. Similarly, the Americans also suspecting many of the, they are targeting the Microsoft, they are targeting the various American networks and systems. The Iranians are responsible for that. They are, of course, they are blaming the Chinese and Russians also. Similarly, Iranians are also being blamed. So in this hybrid warfare, all kinds of, conventional and unconventional methods are being used against each other. So I don't think this will develop into a major war.
Bilesha, usually, I mean, while I think you've heard from both Dr. Vidanage and Amin as well that they do not envision this blowing up into a full-blown sort of World War III kind of scenario. But in the meantime, these wars of attrition that you have going on in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya, where there is, I believe, a ceasefire which is being brokered by the pro-Russian and then pro-Western sort of factions there. But in all of this, you see the very real impact is on ordinary people who turn out to be the migrants as well. I was just reading through an interesting article which you had written for the Newsfirst.lk website on behalf of the IPS research team, where you said that there's a possible scenario where Sri Lanka could sort of phase towards becoming a net immigration country, where we'd be actually taking in more immigrants than we're sending out. As you see Western nations like the United States and many increasingly greater numbers of EU members putting up borders against these immigrants who are fleeing wars and poverty in these sort of conflict-stricken regions, do you feel that, for example, refugees from Yemen might look at Asia, maybe even Sri Lanka, as a safe haven? And do you think that we might start seeing a shift in movement away from the Western towards Asia?
I don't think it will happen immediately, at least in Sri Lanka, for one reason, because Sri Lanka doesn't have in economic terms so much to offer someone who wants to come to Sri Lanka as opposed to the Europe. So there might not be a big attraction in Sri Lanka in that sense, but then also we have to understand in terms of our demographics, we do have a shortage in certain skill sets in Sri Lanka, and then we have an aging population, so there are certain demands. So even though there is no economic attraction to come here, people who are so desperate might start thinking that what Sri Lanka has to offer at the current state might be favorable rather than their home country. But in terms of net immigration, still we are not there. But we have seen in terms of migrant workers coming in different forms via the formal channels. We see a lot of Chinese immigrant workers coming through FDI projects into Sri Lanka, and then we have heard that there's a lot of informal immigrants coming in and working. So sometimes
on the subject of informal immigrants, we saw recently there was a very sort of expansive feature that was, I think, in the Ceylon Today, if I'm not mistaken, looking at Indian migrant workers who were working on construction sites here, who had sort of come in and I think about 1,000 rupees a week or something, was what, if I'm not mistaken, which was what was reported by the newspaper. But so we are starting to see that kind of movement, as you said, the most desperate of the desperate. What, in that article from 2018, you said that new laws, regulations and institutions that are being drafted at present, this is December 2018, should be sufficiently forward-thinking to take Sri Lanka beyond the sort of incipient beginning of immigration to all the way across towards a potential net immigration position. Do you think that from the time you wrote that article to now, which is pretty much the space of 1 year, do you think that we've seen that kind of forward-thinking policies in terms of immigration being developed in Sri Lanka?
The thinking is there, but implementation is not there. Because I think we have been struggling since then to have an institution to regulate incoming migrant workers, immigrant workers. We have the Sri Lanka Bureau of Foreign Employment regulating outgoing migrant workers from Sri Lanka to other countries, but as of now, there is no regulatory authority that governs incoming migrant workers after they step into the country. Until they come in, the Department of Immigration and Immigration, they would do the visa issuance and that sort of things. Immigrant workers come in through BOI projects. The BOI is governing that aspect. But once they are in Sri Lanka, their welfare has to be taken care of, as well as are they sticking to whatever the rights that they've been given? Are they, if they're supposed to work in one project, they should only do that, not do part-time. We heard so many instances where Chinese immigrants or laborers giving tours in Sigiriya. So they came for one purpose. They have to be monitored. We should have an authority that is capable of monitoring that the immigrant workers are sticking to their visa status.
Isn't this the job of the Department of Immigration?
Yes, that side is yes, but then the welfare side of it, there has to be some other institutional arrangement. But there is ongoing discussion. A new act is going to be formed. There is momentum in it, but still it has not taken off. So,
in that same article, you make the interesting observation that we cannot afford any weaknesses in the institutional framework, because this will foster a breeding ground for hostility and friction between natives and foreign-born sort of workers. This applies in the case of refugees as well. I think we've seen sparks in the past with, for example, the case of the Rohingya refugees who were being sheltered at a UNHCR safe house. That potential is there. When you look at when you say that the thought is there, the thinking is there, but the implementation is not, do you fear that that the authorities here in Sri Lanka in the future may be caught in a situation with their pants down, in a manner of speaking?
If we continue to do this reactive arrangement business, it might be difficult to go on, because sooner or later we are going to have a large influx of immigrants coming in, because we don't have so many job categories are not filled in. So we have to think forward how we are going to regulate them, plus assess their qualification. I think one of the dangers is that if partially qualified people come here and we don't have a mechanism to evaluate their qualification to perform whatever the role that they say that they are qualified to do. Let's say a doctor comes in and he is not qualified, and that puts the patient in great danger. So we have to have a lot of institutional arrangements. So if immigrants start coming without such an institutional arrangement, there will be friction within the local or native people performing the same job, because they will feel that the immigrant is taking away their opportunities. So
thank you very much, Bilesha. On that note, we'll go in for a short commercial break. I'm sorry I ate into your time a little bit. But when we come back, we'll be looking more at the policies and the policy directions, rather, that Sri Lanka should be looking at going in this fast-changing international order. Stay tuned, Face the Nation. We'll be right back.
Sunrise Melodies. සතියේ සෑම දිනකම උදෑසන 5ට.
Just get ready for work, 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 work. To me, I be work, 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 work. Beg you something, please. Bounce, 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 bounce. I don't need you or your brand new pants, or your bougie friends. I don't need love, you can make it all dance. Like diamonds. If I was your boyfriend.
Fusion X. බදාදා රාත්‍රී 11ට. Oldies සතියේ දින 5ම දහවල් 1ට.
Good evening. Welcome to Brainbusters with Slip Season 2.
27 schools across the island. 27 selected students testing their brains to win the ultimate championship. The Brainbusters with Slit Season 2.
Brainbusters with Slit. Saturday at 6:30 p.m.
From the limit, we hit the turn.
Rise of Rock ඉරිදා රාත්‍රී 11:30ට.
झुमका पटियाले वाला ईयर विच ऐसा के तेरे नाम नाल सजना वे मेरा दिल धड़के तेरे नाम नाल सजना वे मेरा दिल एक दो तीन चार पाँच छः सात आठ नौ 10 11
Night Bird සතුදා රාත්‍රී 11:30ට.
Welcome back to Face the Nation. We're talking about Sri Lanka's place in a fast-changing sort of global order. When we left off, we were talking about Sri Lanka's immigration policies and the potential for a lack of movement, or the absence rather of an institutional framework to deal with immigration, the potential for it to blow up in our faces. On that note, we go straight into the questions. I believe Shayan has been waiting with a question for Dr.
Thank you,
Videsha
Nadeem. Yes, Dr. Veeratna, following on from what you said earlier, but now just looking at the outgoing migrants from Sri Lanka. We know we have a skilled labour force, and based on what you said in your opening statement as well, you referred to the fact that the current environment discourages migration. Firstly, how important is confidence in terms of the movement of migrants? In this current situation, would you say that confidence is high or not?
There are two types of migrants we have to understand. One are the first-time migrants and the repeat migrants. So for the first-time migrants, this confidence plays a big role because they are going to an unknown country for the first time, and so they would want at least certain things to be not so variable. So right now, when the security is a variable, they might kind of postpone their decision. But for a person who is going for the second time, if he has been in the country, he has a lot of confidence in managing himself in the destination country. This new security concern might not play a large role as much as for a first-time migrant.
Dr. Veeratna, even recently around 33 migrant workers from Kuwait was repatriated to Sri Lanka, citing difficulties at the workplace. Where do we stand? What about our policy when it comes to things like that? When we send workers to work in other countries, do we assure that they are going to have conducive environments where they can work peacefully? Because they were brought back to Sri Lanka citing difficulties at workplace.
I think to a large extent, this is about the misinformation that is fed in during the recruitment process. Because I'm not too sure about these 30 people returning, but often people find that whatever they were promised while in Sri Lanka about the working conditions is not what they really experience once they go there. So then when they have this mismatch in the expectation and the reality in the country of destination, then they kind of find it difficult to handle, and they say it's not working, they can't work in these conditions, so they want to come back. So I think those are the little loopholes in the recruitment process that is driving this sort of returns.
And in this current climate with the tensions high, do you think that there needs to be a change in policy in terms of the movement of migrants from Sri Lanka overseas? Should there be a different way of making better use of the skilled labor? I ask this in light of, for example, the US. The focus has been now shifting, looking inwards. Rather than Americans working overseas, let's make America greater. Does Sri Lanka need to adopt a similar policy?
Yes, I think recently the president mentioned about we have to contain brain drain. That is also type of migration, that this, like the student migration, is kind of a concern for him in a recent speech, he said. So, but in my opinion, migration is not so bad. Even if a person goes, a student goes, he brings back some expertise, or he sends remittances, not only financial remittances, there will be social remittances coming. He might, contribute in various different ways to the economy. But the main thing is we have to keep that link with the person who left. I think in that aspect, Sri Lanka is a little weak. We lose a lot of permanent migrants because we don't continue that link with the migrant. Like in India, they do a good job with these overseas Indians, and they have so many schemes to keep them, in the loop with their home country. So what happens in Sri Lanka is often there's something called step migration. You first go to a first country, and then you kind of get skills in that country, and then you might go to a second country. Often with Sri Lanka, what happens is when you go to the second country, you lose that migrant from Sri Lanka forever, because skilled migrants often leave as a family. So then they go with their kids or spouse, and then there is nobody to send remittances or stay in touch other than a parent or an extended family. So we have to have a mechanism to keep that link going even though people leave the country. But you wanted to see about how whether we will go kind of close doors. That's what you meant, no? I don't think we have the luxury to do that yet, because face it, remittances play a big role in our economy up to now, right? It's about 8% of our GDP, and we rely a lot on that foreign exchange. So maybe one thing that we should really think about is, up to now, about 80% of our migrants go to the Middle East. That is something we have to seriously think about changing, because that concentration in the Middle East is too much. There is so many other opportunities in other countries that we have not exploited well. So we should spread our options, not limiting to the Middle East, especially now given our experience with so many issues in the Middle East and having to handle that in terms of securing our migrant workers. So I think this is another good opportunity to think about diversifying our migrant destinations and look beyond other countries.
The diversifying our migrant destinations requires improving their skill sets.
Also, proper marketing and proper understanding the needs as a country, because there is a segment of people who go on their own to these countries. But we are not properly exploiting it as a country to package our workers and send. It's a wrong term, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that, because we are dealing with people. But in a way, other countries are really looking at other destinations and training their people and sending in a proper way. But I see there's a big gap between our lower skilled workers and high skilled workers, because lower skilled workers are getting the training or whatever that's offered in the institutional framework, like the SLBFE, but the skilled workers often tend to go outside the SLBFE framework, and they go through with their own contacts. But that means there are opportunities outside if we exploited them better.
I mean, when talking about migration or immigration rather, another term that is constantly used in the political discourse in conjunction with immigration is terrorism.
Pardon?
Is terrorism.
Yeah.
You hear this a lot, especially and not exclusive to right-wing sort of rhetoric, but also across the political spectrum. There's this link which is always drawn between immigration and terrorism. I think it's one of the things that you constantly hear from figures like the current UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson or even Donald Trump, is that uncontrolled immigration increases the risk of terrorism. When you were talking about the need for Sri Lanka to sort of, improve our cooperation with the not just the Gulf countries but the Middle Eastern nations as a whole, as one of the ways in which to combat terrorism, are you concerned by the migration patterns that are being witnessed, especially when you consider the Easter attacks as well, and or at the time at least the links that were being drawn in the media and in political circles as well, and in academia as well, the links between immigration and terrorism that were being drawn at that time in the immediate aftermath and going on to even now. Is there cause for concern there?
Yes, I would say terrorism, the type of terrorism we are witnessing now in the Middle East and in other part of the world, the so-called ISIS and Al-Qaeda terrorism, or the so-called, I would not use the word Islamic terrorism. This type of terrorism attracted migration. Usually you migrate from a less affluent country to a richer country. That's how it takes place, the economic migration, the economic refugees are so called. But in this instance, when ISIS established, its caliphate in parts of Iraq, and the migration took place in the reverse order. You got people going from even Sri Lanka. There are about nearly, I think, or they said in our parliament that about 50 odd people from Sri Lanka traveled to Syria, or then joined the ISIS. And people have joined from other countries also, like, say, for instance, in the early days of the ISIS battle or the Syrian war, even the European countries, they turned a blind eye to the migration. The people, the jihadis coming from, France, Germany, UK, and in other countries, they travel to Turkey, and from to Turkey, they cross the border into Syria and then join the war, join the so-called the jihadi forces. So the migration terrorism, it has it can trigger some kind of a migration, to attract people. In fact, Baghdadi, in his first speech, as after declaring himself as a caliph of the Muslim caliphate, he said, he urged all he sent a message to the Muslims all over the world, to say, this is your country, come and join us.
I mean, don't you think it's funny that whilst as you mentioned correctly, it has been raised in Parliament as well, that there were, I think at one point they said there were 36 Sri Lankans who had travelled to either Iraq or Syria, and then they had said, I think later on the number 50 came up. Isn't it a cause for concern for you that it's so easy to just up and go to sort of a flashpoint like that, and that there's no monitoring that's being done via either the Department of Immigration or Immigration or even through Parliament?
Yes, it is. It is a cause for concern. It is. The concern is, we worry is that there's a lacuna in the system of monitoring. Like even the returnees, some of those fellow people who return from these things, they are not monitored. Even the former Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe said Sri Lanka did not have the laws to deal with such people. So they were, once they returned after, taking, participating in battles and in jihadi battles and in terrorism activities. When they come back to Sri Lanka, they have not been, they were allowed to mingle into the society, and they were not being monitored properly. So this was a major concern. So we have to, I think we have to streamline our laws and the systems and the intelligence gathering and intelligence cooperation also. Like for instance, most of the from the Western countries, most of the ISIS fighters, who came from countries like France, and they went back, and caused problems in those countries. Like say for instance in France, in Belgium, in Germany, and I know the early days there was some sympathy for this, the jihadi fighters. They thought, they would join groups like the radical forces in Syria, and then they would overthrow the Syrian government. So there was a great, so they believed, they put a lot of trust in these jihadi fighters, and so they actually the Western countries turned a blind eye to this migration pattern from Europe to Syria, and from Syria to Iraq, and the so-called ISIS caliphate.
I mean, it's very similar to what you saw in Afghanistan during the Cold War with the Mujahideen.
Exactly. During the Afghanistan process, as you said, people came from all over the world. Like Osama bin Laden, for instance, he was a Mujahideen, and they went back and started problems.
Bilesha, Amin mentioned the fact that the Prime Minister had said that at the time, correctly, that there weren't Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe at the time said that at the time we didn't have the laws to deal with these people who were coming back in. Whose fault is it that we don't have that institutional framework or that regulatory framework to deal with returning migrants and so Sri Lankans who may be traveling to questionable parts of the world?
I think we shouldn't categorically say returning migrants, because returning migrants are taken care of very well by the Sri Lanka Bureau of Foreign Employment, and they are reintegrated very well, the migrants who go for foreign employment.
Migrant workers.
Yes. But then I think this all comes down to the issue of, because migration or mobility is it's a right. You should be free to go wherever you want. But I think the nuance here is that if it poses a threat to the country, then I think we should not keep a blind eye. If it is a threat to the country, we should be able to monitor them, observe them, and watch them whether they are getting out of line. And then I'm sure there are so many rules and laws within the country that could pinpoint and say this person is a threat to the national security, so therefore we should take some measures against him. Just because he returned from a country, he shouldn't have a free reign.
Are you concerned? Like, I mean, Amin was saying that it is a cause for concern that you have about 50 people who potentially travel to these areas. When you look at, there doesn't seem to be an end in sight to those continuing sort of what we call wars of attrition there. When you look at, do you see potentially, maybe another batch of Sri Lankans traveling to either Syria or less likely, but maybe even Yemen or other sort of conflict flashpoints, and then sort of returning to the country and not having, and there's no sort of institutional framework to oversee their activities once they come back, or even immigrants coming in to oversee their activities once they're in here. Is this a cause for concern for you?
It is a cause for concern because, as I said before, there are two types of remittances. There are financial remittances and social remittances. So this is one type of a negative social remittance. You go, you experience different things while you're there, you send back certain ideas that we should fight some war or whatever, so kind of attract more people or come back and spread their views. So, but then these are subjective things. Who am I to evaluate somebody else's belief or thought? But at a national level, you can do that if it is a national threat. So as you said, maybe there should be institutions. I think maybe the intelligence or that sort of a institutional framework is the place where I should identify whether this is a threat to the national security, because it's a little nuanced from immigration only. It's kind of intertwined with so many other aspects.
Dr. Vidanage, Harinder, when you're talking about sort of immigration and you know the catchphrases that go along with it, terrorism, and when you, from your perspective, as someone who teaches you know, international relations and geopolitical realities of terrorism, global terrorism, etc., how do you perceive the situation in Sri Lanka?
Are you asking in the context of?
Yeah, in the context of our discussion. In the context of our discussion now on immigration and terrorism.
Well, I think one of the biggest policy challenges we had was we never, you know, it was not just a Sri Lankan problem. One of the, you know, the biggest challenges of the modern, you know, the very recent terrorism trends in terrorism, where countries had to devise what they call countering violent extremism, which is a catchphrase which is kind of catching up in the last few years. One particular reason was to deal with the phenomena of what we call foreign fighters. One was foreign fighters from, you know, fighters who are moving towards flashpoints, as well as fighters who are returning. It's not just Sri Lanka. Many countries didn't really have the record. But to make things worse for us, we have a serious problem in border management. This is called border management because we don't know exactly, you know, we don't have a centralized, you know, the databasing, the whole, there is no electronic firewall in the context of border management in Sri Lanka. I think the current regime is interested, so was the previous, but still we don't see that. So we don't have accurate sets of data about how many people left on what day, where their destinations. Of course, I think we do have a way of manual processing, but I don't know how far that is, you know, is electronic. How far do we have the algorithms to do analysis, you know, to run about where people go, when they come back, how many times have they gone, what kind of offences have they done overseas, you know, I think we have a serious problem of border management. And
outside of border management, do you see a solution to this through international cooperation, as Amin was suggesting, by cooperating with the governments and, you know, improving relations with those countries in those areas? Is that one of the ways through which you can address this?
The primary thing is to kind of set up a border management regime which is integrated. So you know, look at the US. The US also didn't have a proper border management system since 9/11, till 9/11. So what you know, people don't get this. People think the response to 9/11 was war on terrorism, but that's part of it. Actually, they created the Department of Homeland Security. That's the third largest state entity in the US, you know, bureaucratic entity. So most of it is to do with borders, and border management has become a priority. I'm not trying to say it has, you know, we should do the same thing, but to a certain extent, what we see from the UX experience is we don't see foreigners creating foreign terrorist attacks in the US on US soil, but what we see now is what we call lone wolves, or radicalized attacks which are happening, which is also part of this problem of returnees. So I think Sri Lanka, there's a priority when it comes to Sri Lankan policy making. You know, it's a part of a national security priority to have an effective border management regime. But the challenge is we still do not have a national security strategy, so which is also a problem. But I think there are conversations. I think the new administration of President Rajapaksa might look into this very seriously, because that's a priority in Sri Lanka, and that's part of the mandate the new president also got from the people to create a robust national security establishment. So border management is pretty much part of that.
Shan, if I can ask you, again, in light of all that we've discussed, particularly this national security issue, how should Sri Lanka tackle this tricky business of military agreements, taking into context what's been going on right now?
How should Sri Lanka
tackle military agreements with other countries?
Okay.
And
You're
also I
referring
just like to
the SOFA and AXA, things like that?
yes, and also I just want to add we have the Russian foreign minister coming in, we have the Chinese foreign minister coming in, so there's a lot of focus on us.
Yeah, admit that, Sri Lanka is geostrategically very important, country, and especially the Hambantota port is a serious, everyone's, eyeing for it. Beneath Hambantota, you only get the vast ocean, and whoever controls Hambantota will be virtually controlling the southern hemisphere, right? So international, we are caught, admit, whether we like it or not, we are caught in some kind of the conflict. The big powers are, involved in the Indo-Pacific region and or in the global context. We are part of Sri Lanka is in the middle of we are caught in the crossfire, right? So we are under pressure. The agreements are coming from big powers. Like, say, when we talk about big powers, we're talking about the United States, China, and the regional power India. They all want some kind of a military deal with Sri Lanka, right? Or some kind of an arrangement, or whether it is terrorism related or whether it is some other form, they need to have. So we have the former president signed a defense deal just before, a few months before, he retired. He signed a defense deal with China, and that we have signed AXA with the United States, and we are under pressure to sign. We are not under pressure. The SOFA is there, and but look at what is happening in other countries. Like, for instance, Iraq. Now, Iraq had a SOFA with America, with the United States, and it expired in somewhere in 2008 or 9. And with that, the Americans, withdrew their troops, and then when the ISIS came back to, when ISIS created problem in Syria and Iraq and set up its caliphate, and then the Iraqi government requested the Americans to come. So this was a basic understanding. So there is some kind of an arrangement. It's not really a SOFA as such. The SOFA they had, that was before, right? But later on they signed an agreement. There are lots of loopholes in that. So both countries, I don't know, in the sense, can interpret it differently. And the Americans, need not, when they wanted to attack, the target killing, assassinate Qasem Soleimani, IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard commander, they had just, not said that, in terms of, if they are trying to violate the Iraqi airspace and Iraq's sovereignty, they are bound by that agreement to inform the Iraqi government. But it looks like it had not happened that way, the way Iraqis wanted it to happen. Actually, but some say the United States, someone called and said, we are planning a target killing in Iraq. So the Iraqi Prime Minister had said, is it so? Something like that. But they had not given the specific target or that they're going to violate. So this is something, if this can happen in a simple arrangement between, when Iraq and United States have a simple, not really a SOFA, but imagine the situation if we have something like SOFA. So we have to be very, very careful when we sign these agreements. Like, say, for instance, Japan and South Korea, they had the status of forces agreement with the United States, but with certain things happening. Say, for instance, the Okinawa rape case, the famous, the infamous case, the Japanese wanted the rephrase certain provisions of the agreement. So we have to take into account all those things, and if we want to really go ahead, and if it is also if it suits only our national interests, but I don't think that kind of agreement will be in our national interest, to some kind of a military thing, a temporary thing in terms of, say, for instance, when the war on terror started with 2001. So we were willing at that time to cooperate with the United States, to, because we want to be part of the war on terror. And we cooperated, and that time, that led to the 2004 EXA and the deal with the United States. So in that context, yes, but at that time in 2004 and also Sri Lanka was also pursuing a war on terror. So we needed the world's support. So we also have to be part of the world war on terror and the local war on terror.
Thank you. I mean, on that note, we're going for a short commercial break. It's a final round break and return.
Thank you.
Sunrise Melodies සතියේ සෑම දිනකම උදෑසන 5ට.
Just get ready for work, 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 work. To me, I be work, 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 work. Beg you something, please. Bounce, 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 bounce. I don't need you or your brand new bounce, or your bougie friends. I don't need love, you can make diamonds. Love like diamonds.
If I was your boyfriend. Fusion X බදාදා රාත්‍රියේ 11ට.
दिल का सुकून है मोहब्बत दिल की तड़प है ये इंतजार कोई मिल गया मेरा दिल गया
OGs සතියේ දින 5ම දහවල් 1ට.
Welcome back to Face the Nation. We're in conversation with Dr. Harinda Vidanage, Executive Director of the Bandaranaike Center for International Studies, Mr. Amin Izzuddin, Deputy Editor of the Sunday Times and International Editor for the Vijay Group at large, and also Dr. Bilesha Veeraratna, Research Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies, who specializes in immigration and emigration or migration. Dr. Vidanage, this final round, I'd actually like to start with you. In Sri Lanka, politicians constantly love to talk about how we have a non-aligned foreign policy. In this sort of changing global atmosphere, with the rise of China on one hand, the rise of the Asian tigers or the ASEAN countries on the other hand, what is being seen by some as the decline of US reach and power in certain areas as well. Do you feel that regardless of what we say about having a non-aligned policy, that at some point down the line that Sri Lanka may be forced to pick a side?
I don't personally believe that we will be forced to take a side, because who's going to force us? Because that has been the argument for a long time, But I think we are in this very interesting moment, opportune moment, where, say, if the US wants to force us, they know there's a limit to force, because there are alternatives. So that's the opportunity we have. But we have to manage it in a way that we can use this, maximize this opportunity. Nobody wants to force Sri Lanka at this particular point, because it means there is an alternative for Sri Lanka to choose. So that's why you're seeing all the top level diplomats flying into Sri Lanka. Those days we were desperately chasing big powers to kind of get things done. This time it seems like the other way around. We have the Russian foreign minister, we have very senior deputy secretary of state, then we have a very senior Chinese, politician. So we see so much of interest, and we had the foreign minister of India coming in as soon as the presidential elections was over. So there itself, we can see there is significant interest on Sri Lanka, given the context that we have been talking about, the recent geopolitical alignment. So which means Sri Lanka has the opportunity to unleash what I call multi-engagement, not non-alignment. Non-alignment was pretty much 20th century. Non-alignment came in the context of a Cold War. There is no Cold War. We are living in a time when there is significant American recession, as well as significant emergence of multiple centers of power. So Cold War is not possible within this scenario. So that means non-alignment is a kind of, in a way redundant, as there are still strong, even within Sri Lanka's foreign policy establishment, there are believers of non-alignment. But what I feel is 21st century is all about engagement. When you say non-alignment, there's always a letting go. There's always, that means we will work. So I think there is always too much of letting go in non-alignment. But 21st century is all about engagement, engaging China, engaging India, engaging the US, as well as all the other countries. For example, look at the interest Australia has on Sri Lanka. Look at the interest Japan has on Sri Lanka. So I think we are living in that particular opportune moment where multiple layers of engagement are possible. But what type of engagement do we choose? Strategic engagement with India, strategic engagement with the US, economic engagement with China, economic engagement with Japan. So there are options. That's a panoply of options open for foreign policy. So this idea of neutrality is very important. I don't think idea of neutrality is non-alignment. These are two different.
Do you think entities in this sort of changing international relations climate that you speak of, do you feel that entities like SAARC or even BIMSTEC will have a greater role to play as far as Sri Lanka's sort of foreign policy is concerned?
Yeah, what we have is, this is what we call, SAARC and BIMSTEC are two different.
Yeah.
SAARC comes from what we call regional integration. But if you look in the 21st century, it's less of regional integration, it's more of regional cooperation. That's where BIMSTEC comes in. This is a big, this is a big puzzle. This is a big confusion people have. People try to conflate SAARC with BIMSTEC, ASEAN plus SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation. SCO is not SAARC. It's not the story of regional integration was EU, stuff like that, ASEAN, SAARC. But I think 21st century, what we're seeing is nobody wants to be totally integrated because integration is in crisis. EU is the best example. But everybody wants to work together. That's where we call this regionalism versus regionalization. So people conflate this idea. Regionalization is creating robust, integrated mechanisms such as the EU. But regionalism is creating loose coalitions of working arrangements, such as BIMSTEC. And most of these regionalisms are led by a certain regional power. So SCO is China-led, BIMSTEC is India-led. But they all create spaces of opportunity for countries like Sri Lanka, because that means we are not tied to things like integration. We don't have to give up certain aspects of our sovereignty, create a massive bureaucracy, and the complexities of regionalization is not there. So I think to answer that question you asked, yes, these new regional arrangements, which are loose regional arrangements, will always come. These are obvious reality of today's environment. But so it's all about what we call regional cooperation. But I think there is a lot for Sri Lanka to benefit from regional cooperation, because the regions are not demarcated purely geographically. SAARC was geographically demarcated. BIMSTEC is not geographically demarcated, because it gives us a large periphery to work with.
Thank you, Dr. Bandaranaike. Thank you again for joining us on the show this evening. Mr. Izzadeen, I'd like to come to you next. When I'm actually going to pose the same question, do you think that when you're covering these stories, when you look at how the world is changing, do you feel that there may come a time when in the near future when Sri Lanka may be forced to pick a side? maybe like abandon sort of non-aligned policy, at least in name?
Yeah, as Dr. Vidanake said, non-aligned movement is now a defunct organization. What we have is some kind of, developing country, unity, or a loose developing country, some solidarity movement, at different level, and that too is. I wouldn't say that we are united that the way we were united during the non-aligned time. Every country is thinking in terms of its own national interest. There was no altruism in our foreign policy. We are selfish. We think in terms of Sri Lanka first, right? So similarly, other countries think even the big powers must be thinking, yes, their country is first, right? So in a situation like that, we have to think in terms of our own national interest. So it also depends on the leadership that we have at that time in the future. Perhaps that particular leadership is with a mindset to side with some country. What if that particular leadership is thinking that way? Like say we have to side with one country or the other, and then there's also the danger of we are accumulating debt. There's a lot of people thinking, the Americans are, showing the warning signals saying that, you guys are getting more and more aid from loans from Chinese companies and Chinese banks, and that you have to pay back. The previous government, in order to pay back loans, had to borrow more loans. The same situation still exists. Our economy is in a dire strait, so we have to borrow more money. So to run our projects, we have put most of our mega projects on hold because I think maybe because there was budget issue, and not only that, physically there's no money in the system. So therefore we don't know how we will be in that particular point, whether we will be in some kind of bankruptcy or whether we in an economically strong position, and the mindset of the leaders in that during that period. So it all depends on.
We could even be like Laos, completely beholden to China.
Yes, true. Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amin Izzuddin, the Deputy Editor, Sunday Times, and International Editor for the Vijay Group. Dr. Bilesha Veeraratne, my final question is to you. Early on in the program, when we were talking about, you were talking about how when it comes to establishing a more forward-looking or more sort of visionary, let's say, institutional and policy framework as far as immigration and migration in Sri Lanka are concerned. You said the thinking is there, but there's a bit of a lapse in the implementation. In a recent contribution to the IPS blog, you had written about how in the aftermath of the Easter attacks, actually, you were talking about how we could integrate changes to tighten border control in Sri Lanka, since both national policies on migration and immigration are currently on the drawing boards. The National Migration Policy of 2009 is being revised, while the very first immigration policy is being drafted, and you also noted that the Immigration and Immigration Control Act is also to be revised. What is the, as far as you're aware, what is the current status of these revisions and amendments?
The National Labour Migration Policy, the revision is almost done, so I think it has a little bit of loose ends to be tied. But the other two, I'm not so familiar to say about the current status, but all I know is it's highly needed. It's timely because we have to get it out soon so that we will be ready for the future, because Sri Lanka is not going to be like this for a long time. It is going to be developed, and there will be more interest in inward migration. So we have to be ready and have a properly functioning institutional arrangement to act when the time comes. We can't be reactive and drawing plans or acts at that point. So
you say that we need to be more proactive when it comes to our policy making.
Yes.
Bilesha, you, as I mentioned in a previous article, you said that there could be a time when Sri Lanka becomes a net immigration country, where taking in more immigrants than we're sending out migrants. If I were to ask you to sort of make a prediction on how far down the line that is it a decade, 2 decades, half a century?
So let's see. Outward migration has started going down. So in about 2014, we had about 300,000 migrants leaving a year. Now it's down to 211,000 a year. So it's going to taper off or stabilize sometime soon. And inward migration has picked up, we know that. Official statistics, official channels are still limited because we have not opened our doors yet. But there is informal immigration coming that shows the interest towards Sri Lanka. So one fine day, these two forces are going to balance out, and then net immigration is going to go. So you are asking me when? Maybe within the next decade or two?
Decade or two. Thank you. We hope that the policy making gets really proactive really fast then. Thank you very much, Dr. Bidesha Weeraratne, Research Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies, for joining us this evening. Thank you also again to Mr. Amin Izzuddin, the Deputy Editor of the Sunday Times and International Editor for the Vijay Group. And thank you again to Dr. Harinda Vidanage, Executive Director of BCIs. Dr. Harinda, very quick question for you. Do you envision a future in which Sri Lanka can exercise a kind of soft power foreign policy that you see from countries like Qatar?
Yeah, there's the opportunity for Sri Lanka's soft power is creating the platform. Because Sri Lanka, if you look at the Indian Ocean, is the only country which is quite open, for the policy dialogues that can happen within the region. What we lack is the Shangri-La dialogue that Singapore is capable of doing. Shangri-La is a very strategic dialogue, but when it comes to next 10 years, the region will be desperate to find a space where all the competing powers could converge.
So there is opportunity in the South Asian and Southeast Asian region for Sri Lanka as a key player. Thank you again to Shehan Ranatunga and Nazra Hassan for being on the show to ask their questions this evening. Foreign policy is a very divisive issue in Sri Lanka. You see that division in our mainstream political camps as well, and it also comes up in social conversation. What do you think Sri Lanka's foreign policy priorities should be? Do let us know. Until next time, good night and good luck.